They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. It's Sabbath and it's Anzac Day. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, in your lounge room, on your phones, it's a privilege to share this time with you. Anzac Day is probably the most sacred day of the year for most Australians. But these are the strangest of times. Who would have thought that we would have been spending Anzac Day in this way? In any usual time, right across the country, in every city and town and village, Australians would be gathering at dawn for services and marches to commemorate Anzac Day. Little children and teens hustled out of bed in the darkness by their parents, standing quietly in the pre-dawn as they acknowledge the cost of freedom. But today, it is different. We face an unseen enemy that is causing havoc, and the best we can do is a private celebration with a lone bugler on the driveway and a candle to light up the dawn. Of course, we have tried. We face an unseen enemy that is causing havoc, but it's not the same, and we wish it could be different. We're normally such a gregarious people who love to get out and go to the beach, go for a swim, or go camping in the bush, or have a picnic or a barbecue. But we've been forced into isolation and social distancing and staying at home. But as events unfold, we are more than ever grateful that we live in this great country, Australia. And our pride shines brightly no matter what restrictions are in place this Anzac Day. Anzac Day had its origins in events that took place 105 years ago in a distant land on April 25, 1915. It wasn't a mighty victory that we celebrated, but a defeat, a withdrawal that we simply remember. But it has special significance for us as Australians because it was our first involvement in war as a separate nation and signified our coming of age. It established our identity in the world as distinctly Australian. Young Australians and New Zealand soldiers were sent to fight for king and country in a far distant shore. They went off to war with an attitude that it was a great lark, a big adventure, like going off to the footy. And they were soon to realise that it was no game. And the performance of these Anzacs set a standard by which all Australian forces from that time forward are judged. Even though they had trained hard in Egypt, they were inexperienced in war, but in this furnace of bitter, close, hand-to-hand combat, traditions were forged that have shone brightly ever since. These can be described in single words: courage, endurance, self-sacrifice, mateship, equality, initiative, and leadership by example. Shortly after 2 a.m. on the 25th of April, 3 battleships arrived off what was to later become known as Anzac Cove. And they stopped there to lower their boats. 1,500 Australians assembled quietly on the decks, And then with heavy packs and their rifles slung over their shoulders, they went down the ladders into the darkness. They sat quietly in the boats, tightly packed together as they were towed towards the shore. And as the dawn was breaking, the signal was given and the men jumped out of the boats and began wading the last 50 metres towards the shore. Most stumbled through the water to the beach. Some were hit. A few were dragged down by the weight of their packs and drowned. The men had been told that they would find level ground and fairly easy going, but instead an unknown cliff reached up before them. And as they hauled themselves upward, clutching at roots and boulders and kicking footholds in the dirt, a heavy fire came down on them from the heights above, and bullets and shrapnel were pinging all around them. And soon the air was filled with shouts and cries, and some lost their grip and tumbled down into the gullies. Those who actually reached the top went charging off after the enemy and were soon lost. The sunrise saw a scene that was never imagined in any of the battle plans. The wild scramble went on, and no one could be sure of anything except that the Allies were ashore and building up their reinforcements. In fact, they never really captured very much more land than that they achieved in that first mad and frenzied battle. But they were there to stay, and then there followed so many battles and so many acts of heroism. One of the first diggers to hit the beach at Gallipoli was Albert Jacka, who joined in the first few days of the war and served with such distinction that his battalion became known as Jacka's mob. On one occasion, he succeeded in capturing a Turkish trench by diving in headfirst and subduing the occupants. It was the stuff of legend that when his commanding officer finally peered over the edge of the strangely silent trench, Jacka was lazily smoking a cigarette, and he commented laconically, "Well, I managed to get the beggars, sir." He would eventually go on to win the Victoria Cross 3 times over. He survived the war, and when he died in 1932, his 8 pallbearers were all winners of the Victoria Cross, the only men good enough to take such a champion to his grave. It was not only the soldiers, there were others. The medics, the signallers, the engineers, the support and transport people, and then the chaplains. Roman Catholic Father John Fay from Western Australia. The chaplains were not supposed to be in the first landing, but John Fay was unwilling to be left behind, and he stowed away in one of the boats so that he could be among his men when they landed. He was the only chaplain of any denomination on the peninsula for many days. He buried the dead, offered comfort to the living, Catholic, Protestant, unbeliever alike, and staying alongside the men in the dugouts and the trenches. His career was marked with miracle. At the landing, he found a flat stone on the beach and held it up in front of his head. And seconds later, a Turkish bullet smacked into the stone and smashed the rock while all around him died. He related later that during his time at Gallipoli, 4 shrapnel bullets ripped through his haversack and destroyed the contents. A bullet passed clean through his overcoat, not leaving a scratch on his body. He had a book shot out of his hand, and a jam tin from which he was eating was blown apart. His tobacco tin was drilled, and his waterproof sheet was torn apart by bullets. Having escaped so far, I don't think I can get hit, he wrote to his father 4 weeks after the landing. Another chaplain was Fighting Mac, William Mackenzie. On the 6th of August 1915, Mackenzie's battalion was waiting to attack the Turks at Lone Pine. The Turkish trenches were deep and covered with logs and earth, and everyone knew that the attack would be costly. Mackenzie should have stayed in the rear trenches, but instead he was with the men. And as they charged, Mackenzie followed, carrying nothing but a spade. And he was to need it over the next few weeks. He sorted the living from the dead and buried 450 men. And for his actions at Gallipoli, he was decorated with the Military Cross. There were months of stalemate in the trenches to come, and through the terrible heat of the summer, with steady losses due to casualties and illness, life in the trenches was terrible. The food was bad and monotonous, and then there was the stench and the flies. Always there was the sniper's bullet to take out the careless. The story is told in the cemeteries that are dotted all over the battlefield. It's a sobering and a moving experience to visit them. Each grave has its own story. Private T.H. Mills from Bendigo, killed in action and buried at Lone Pine. His epitaph, "He died to save Australia, our Anzac hero." John Simpson, the man with the donkey, who so bravely saved so many lives that he became an Australian icon. He signed up as a medic, and just after the landing he was carrying a wounded soldier down Shrapnel Gully when he spied a donkey, and he found that the donkey was better than his shoulders. And it said that he would sing and whistle, seemingly to ignore the bullets that were flying around him while tending his charges. It is estimated that he had at least 5 donkeys because the others were killed or wounded in action. Each one of them had a name. There was Duffy 1, Duffy 2, Murphy, Queen Elizabeth and Abdul. But he lasted only 3.5 weeks, dying on the 19th of May, aged 22. I found the grave of Trooper Bert Bellinger, 19 years of age, who was firing through a loophole when a bullet came glancing along the barrel of his gun and killed him. And then there was Commander Edward Cater. I found his grave too. The naval officer in charge of the landings at Anzac Cove. He won everybody's respect while helping others avoid the shell fire on the beach. The Australians knew him as the bloke with the eyeglass, because although many British officers wore monocles, Cater's was a king-size one. And in typical fashion, the Australians, as they approached him, would put their identity discs in their eye to have a go at him. Cater looked at them and then removed his glass, threw it up in the air, and then caught it back in his eye. He said, "There you go. Do that, you blighters." He was killed on the beach when he ran to help some men who were being hit by shrapnel fire. On the 7th of August 1915, on a tiny battlefield of the Neck, right up on the top of the ridge, where the trenches were separated only by the width of a narrow road, and where you could throw a tin of bully beef into the Turkish trenches and receive a tin of tobacco in return. The light horsemen charged out of the trenches in 3 waves of about 150 men. And they were cut to pieces as they leapt out over the top. Trooper Harold Rush of the 10th Light Horse Regiment died in the 3rd wave. His body was one of the few that was identified, and he is buried in Walker's Ridge Cemetery. His epitaph famously reads, his last words, "Goodbye, Cobber, God bless you." At last, in December, the decision was made to evacuate, which actually was the best planned and executed operation of the whole campaign, but it did mark the ultimate failure of the campaign and victory for the Turks. After the withdrawal from Gallipoli, the Anzac soldiers were sent to the Western Front in France to fight the Germans on the battlefields of Flanders and the Somme. They were tired and ill-prepared, and many didn't have the right equipment. And about a third of them didn't even have helmets. And within a week, they saw their first action at a place called Fromelles. The Germans had been there for a year and were dug in with concrete bunkers. For the Aussies, time was measured in days. Allied soldiers were told to regain the ground that was captured by the Germans, and they successfully did this and breached the first of the German lines. But the second line was not where the troops had been told it would be, and it was a disastrous mistake. Forced out into no man's land, the British and Australian troops were ruthlessly cut down by shells and shrapnel and machine guns. The Australian War Memorial describes the battle as the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire history. In one night of fighting, there were 5,533 casualties, killed, missing and wounded. 2,000 died, and the majority of the bodies lay out in no man's land for 3 years before they could be recovered. And those who were wounded were stuck in the shell holes or on the barbed wire, and nobody could get out in the daylight to get them. But over the next 3 or 4 days, a few brave souls would sneak out at night to the rescue. The Australians could hear and see the movement out in no man's land, so they went out there to try and recover their wounded cobbers. In the days after the battle, Sergeant Simon Fraser from Victoria went out often. It was no easy task to pick up a man and to carry him on your back, particularly if he had a serious wound or a broken bone. If no stretcher was available, you had to lie down and manoeuvre him onto your shoulders and then stand up in full view of the enemy and possible flying bullets. Fraser described the cries of the wounded and how impossible it was for those who heard them not to respond, despite the dangers to the rescuers' own lives. One man he heard calling out weighed 88 kilos, and Fraser later wrote, I couldn't lift him on my back, but I managed to get him into an old trench and told him to lie quiet while I got a stretcher. And then another man nearby sang out, "Don't forget me, cobber." I went in and got 4 volunteers with stretchers, and we got both men out safely. The Cobbers Memorial near Fromelles commemorates his bravery. Unfortunately, Simon was later killed in the Battle of Bouilcourt on the Western Front. We need to remember that these men were not professional soldiers. They were ordinary Aussies doing ordinary jobs before enlisting. And as well as that, they were volunteers. One of them was Robert Courtney Green from Western Australia. He was desperate and facing destitution because of his drought-ravaged farm outside of Fremantle. And he signed up with the Australian Army in 1916 in the hope that he would get some money to solve his problems. But he was sent straight to the front line at Fromelles to join the fighting. On the day of the disastrous battle, he was hit by shrapnel in the chest and he bled to death in the trenches. His body was never recovered at that time. He left behind his heartbroken fiancée, Nancy, Pearson, a 25-year-old Scottish immigrant. For years, Nancy would pen letters to her missing love. She writes to him, "My Bob, my love, my handsome, I love you so much." And then through the forensic work of a Melbourne school teacher, Lambus Inglesos, in the late 2000s, the existence of an unmarked and forgotten mass grave containing the remains of Allied soldiers killed during the battle was discovered at Pheasant Wood, just a stone's throw from Fromelles. The bodies had been transported there by German soldiers on a narrow gauge railway and were buried in 8 large pits. These grave pits had not been discovered during the official post-war burial campaigns. And so a new war cemetery, situated as close as possible to the burial pits, was established. The first new one for 50 years. And on the 19th of July 2010, 94 years after the battle, 170 soldiers were buried there. And Robert Courtney Green, the love of Nancy's life, was finally laid to rest. But it was not all defeat. The Anzac forces, led by Sir John Monash, who has been described as the finest general on the Western Front, became a formidable fighting force with a reputation for victory and for bravery. Long before the great German offensive of 21st of March 1918, the enemy knew where the strength of the Allied forces lay, and they were careful not to attack where the Anzac forces were in the front line. In fact, after the 8th of August, captured German commanders were admitting that the combination of tanks and Australians coming through the dawn mist was overwhelming. I have here in my hands the Rising Sun badge. It's there on the digger's hat beside me as well. This one was found on the battlefield of the Somme on the Western Front in France. It is the badge that was worn by Australian soldiers on their lapels and on their hats. It's the badge under which the original Anzacs went into battle. The badge under which all succeeding Aussies have fought. It has become a symbol of what it means to be Australian. And it reminds me of all of the iconic battles that have been fought over the last 105 years that have demonstrated the true Anzac spirit. There are so many, but time only allows I mention a few. The Rising Sun was worn by the light horsemen in the last great cavalry charge at Beersheba in Palestine. They liberated the wells in the town, recovering 90,000 gallons of fresh, drinkable water, as well as many other supplies. It was worn in the Battle of Le Hamel, which was fought on the 4th of July 1918 under the leadership of John Monash. It was an extremely well-planned campaign. Monash said that the battle would last 90 minutes. It was all over in 92. It was worn in Tobruk, where 14,000 Aussie soldiers were part of a force that held out for 8 months against the best that the German General Rommel could hurl at them, and they became known as the Rats of Tobruk for their stubbornness. In fact, the Rising Sun had a special significance in Tobruk. During the daylight hours, the soldiers would lie out in their trenches waiting for the hot sun to go down so that they could get around and do their things at night. And the most feared of the soldiers were the Gurkhas, the Indian soldiers, and they would stealthily creep around the battlefield, and a person could suddenly feel an arm coming around your neck, and that arm would go to the lapel and it would feel for the rising sun. And if the rising sun was there, they would say, "She'll be right, Dig, see you later." But if it wasn't there, well, you can understand what would happen. The rising sun was worn in Korea from 1950 to 53. It was worn at Milne Bay on the 25th of August 1942. Although the battle was a relatively minor battle, it was a significant morale booster because it was the first real land defeat suffered by the Japanese. It was worn on the Kokoda Track, where the members of the 39th Regiment, which was actually a reserve regiment, were stationed. The regulars called them the Chocos because they thought that they would melt when the heat was on. But they held back the Japanese advance over the mountains to Port Moresby. And the stories of the Kokoda Track are of incredible bravery, incredible endurance and suffering. But they did hold them back. It was worn in Singapore and Malaya and Borneo and Sandakan. It was also worn at the Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam, where 100 Australian soldiers were attacked by 1,500 Viet Cong guerrillas in a rubber plantation in what was to become Australia's biggest battle during the Vietnam War. It was worn in Iraq and Afghanistan when Australian soldiers joined the war against terror. So many places, so many stories. We could go on and on. But the Australians were good soldiers. But if they had a fault, it was that they had a disrespect of authority. And the Australian officers thought that they had a right to respect because of birth or position, and they couldn't understand the Australians very well because their officers had to earn the respect of the men, and they were together in the trenches. One of my favourite stories that demonstrates this comes from Tobruk. And there was a very pompous little English captain, and he, with his Batman and his swagger stick, decided one day that he was going to go out and visit the Australians. And there he fronted up at the trench where Australians were digging in, only to find that the men were stripped down to their waist, sweating, without a shirt on their backs, and he couldn't understand it. And he said, as he stood on the edge of the trench, "Don't you know that you should salute an officer?" And with that, one of the sweating soldiers in the trench slowly climbed out and grabbed his shirt, on which were the epaulets of a major. And he stood there in front of the captain and said, "Well, now you can salute." At Tobruk, ABC journalist Chester Wilmot wrote of the Anzacs, "The spirit which has made Australia is the spirit that held Tobruk. The inspiring and binding force of Australian life isn't tradition or nationalism or social revolution. It's quite a simple thing. Henry Lawson called it mateship, the spirit which makes men stick together. In Australia, by sticking together, men have defied drought, bushfire and flood. In Tobruk, they have scorned hardship and danger and death because no digger would ever let his cobbers down." And Wilmot goes on to write, "In Tobruk, for the first time in this war, the Germans were thrust back by a spirit that even tanks and dive bombers could not conquer." And so the Anzac tradition and the spirit of mateship grew and continues to grow to this day through conflict after conflict, war after war. And it comes to the front in times of stress and disaster, because when calamity strikes, there is a wholly bipartisan response. We've seen it many times. We saw it in the Mud Army after the disastrous Brisbane floods in 2011. We are seeing it in the Care Army during the current crisis that faces our country, as the unseen enemy of COVID-19 spreads its deadly tentacles imperceptibly across our community, and we are faced with the strange demand for social isolating and the closure of so many things that make our life what it is here in Australia. That same spirit of mateship is alive and well today as we confront this common enemy, and as we live together yet apart and help each other in our everyday lives. That same rising sun under which our Anzac soldiers fought reminds us that we will get over this. The sun will rise on a bright tomorrow. We are not abandoned. There is hope. God is still in control. Scriptures say in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 2, But you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. How much we need the Son of Righteousness to rise and bring that healing today. We're dismayed when we see the news with its litany of suffering and disease and financial strife and all of the other disastrous results of the current crisis, and it tends to make us anxious and afraid. A couple of weeks ago, after Lindley and I had viewed the live stream here from the Springwood Church, we tuned into Loma Linda University church service and heard a brilliant sermon by Pastor Randy Roberts, who is the senior pastor of what is perhaps one of our largest Seventh-day Adventist churches. He preached from his office because they too are in lockdown and the churches are empty. And he reflected on a text in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. It's a text that we all know well. Cast all of your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And Pastor Roberts reminded us that Peter in this text tells us that in these anxious times there is one thing that we must do, and there is one thing that we must know. The thing to do, cast all your anxiety on him, on God. God is big enough to take everything that we could throw at him, all of our anxieties. And the thing to know is that he cares for you. That knowledge and assurance can give us confidence to move into a very uncertain future. And we can be confident that God knows. He knows us. He knows the issues that confront us. He knows our joys. He knows our sorrows. He knows our challenges. And he cares for us. And he is still in control, standing in the shadows, keeping watch upon his own. What comfort that can bring. And so today, this Anzac Day, we salute those who lost all in the past to preserve our freedom. Scripture says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. But we also salute those today who are doing their best at the present time to defeat our common enemy, those who have to make those enormously difficult decisions, then those who have to administer and implement those decisions, those on the front line who risk their lives to care for the sick and the dying, and those thousands of support people who keep our essential services going and ensure we have food and power and water and education for our children. And then there's the rest of us who, albeit rather reluctantly, abide by the new regulations and keep ourselves separate and safe. We're all together in this. We've heard it so often. We are together in this. And so on this Anzac Day, we acknowledge the contribution of all to our lives here in Australia. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace, now and always. Amen.